Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni, and welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time, from international relations and global economics to philosophy and science. No topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we're going to be talking about the 20th anniversary of the 2003 Iraq War. On March the 20th, 2003, the United States and its allies launched a military invasion of Iraq, which led to a long and controversial conflict that still has significant impacts on the world today. To discuss this topic, we have with us today Emma Skye. Emma is the founding director of Yale's International Leadership Center. She is also a lecturer at the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs, where she teaches great power competition and cooperation, global affairs, grand strategy and refugees, and Middle East politics. Emma, welcome to The Focus, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
Emma, the US and its allies invaded Iraq in 2003. The US and its allies justified the invasion of Iraq by citing Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction and its alleged ties to terrorist organizations, but particularly Al-Qaeda. However, after the invasion, it was discovered that Iraq did not have any WMDs, and there was no concrete evidence linking Iraq to Al-Qaeda. Was there a darker conspiracy to go after Iraq, since none of the evidence for Saddam's misdeeds seemed to be real?
John, I think many people worried and they feared that there was a conspiracy that the US was going to invade Iraq after 9/11 because it was terrified that there might be another attack. And the rationale for the invasion was that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction, which, as you said, was found to be discovered not to be true. So I think, most intelligence agencies really did believe that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. We knew that he had them before because he'd used them. He'd used them against his own population, the Kurds. He'd used them against the Iranians. And, there'd been numerous efforts that had been underway since Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990 to ensure that he did away and he removed his weapons of mass destruction. But he always behaved in a suspicious manner. So every time weapons inspectors went in, there was always different shenanigans that were going on. So it led to the suspicion that maybe he still had weapons of mass destruction. And things might have continued that way if it hadn't been for 9/11. But after 9/11, I think President Bush sitting there in the White House, really feeling he'd let America down. He'd failed to prevent the attack by Al-Qaeda, and he was terrified that there would be another attack. And so then it became a matter of trying to preempt such attacks and fearing where might the next attack come from. Most intelligence analysts didn't believe there was a connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam, because Saddam was the type of leader that Al-Qaeda sought to remove. So that piece was really unsubstantiated. But I think, after Saddam was captured in December 2003, and after he was interrogated, they asked him, why did you pretend that you had weapons of mass destruction? And his response was, he didn't want to look weak. He was fearful that Iran or Israel might attack if he looked weak. But he thought that the West, particularly the US, knew that he didn't have any WMD because, they had removed his WMD.
So in actual fact, having dealt with open source intelligence for much of my career, could you say quite honestly this was an intelligence failure? There seemed to be a lot of groupthink around what we believed Saddam had and what his motivations were. But, dictators, they lie, but sometimes they also tell the truth, especially when they have nothing more to give. So really, was there this situation where Saddam was trying to balance a very weak Iraq off against stronger Iran on the one side, and the likelihood of an Israeli strike on the other. I mean, surely that would have had to have been part of the calculus. And if it was, that intelligence agencies never took that on board, that sounds like a failure to me.
I think it was an intelligence failure. When the CIA did their own sort of analysis of what happened, they criticized themselves for a failure of imagination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Failure to understand why might Saddam have behaved in that way. And it's a it's a really important one because it really looks at confirmation bias. You're so sure that something's there that you fail to see all the stuff that says it's not there. And at the end of the day, Western intelligence agencies didn't have anyone close to Saddam's inner circle. So they couldn't say with any precision or any confidence of why Saddam, of what weapons Saddam might have, or really understand why Saddam was behaving in such a manner. So yes, it was a massive intelligence failure.
Emma, so the failure to find WMDs not only was an intelligence failure, as we've just said, but it was also a significant blow to the credibility of the US government and its allies. What were the consequences of this internationally?
The invasion of Iraq lacked legitimacy because it didn't get a UN Security Council resolution specifically to invade. Now, the Bush administration would argue that there had been a dozen UN resolutions on Iraq. But you remember that Tony Blair in particular set out to get a specific UN Security Council resolution that would allow the invasion to take place. And the French and other Security Council members refused to endorse that. So in the end, it was the coalition of the willing, the US and the UK, that invaded Iraq without that UN resolution. And that's what led Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General of the time, to say this war is illegal. Now, having said that, I think if what happened after the invasion had gone well, then the lack of legitimacy for the war would have faded in people's minds. I mean, when you look at Kosovo, for instance, that intervention happened without a specific UN resolution, but it was generally seen as going well, creating an end to violence and having a good outcome. I think in Iraq, because what happened after the invasion went so disastrously wrong and led to the deaths of, we don't know how many, maybe 500,000 Iraqis died in the aftermath of the invasion. And when you look at what Iraqi society went through and the change in the balance of power in the region in Iran's favor, the knock-on effect to regional proxy wars and civil wars, that the war is really seen as a disaster for US foreign policy and obviously for the UK as well.
Do you think, Emma, that the real central mistake in all of this was not utilizing or co-opting Baathists who could have been turned to American interests and just, casting all of them under the one pro-Saddam brush and then getting rid of them, leaving the policing on the ground in Iraq's major cities to a very light foreign intervention force, which never had the capacity to actually get on top of local strife when it broke out? Do you think that we would have been in a better situation had we kept I think there was somewhere in the vicinity of about 200,000 Baathists employed and acting on behalf of Western interests in Iraq? Will we be in a different position?
You can always look at the counterfactuals and think, could we have done this well? If we had invaded Iraq and invaded with sufficient forces, if we had kept the Iraqi army in place, kept the Ba'ath Party in place, could the outcome have been different? But we didn't do that. Basically, we're working on the assumption that Iraqis would greet us as liberators, that they would be pleased to be liberated. And the orders that went through very early on were to dismiss the security forces and to dismiss not just the top 100 members of the Ba'ath Party, when it went into the thousands and tens of thousands. So inadvertently, it collapsed the state. And having told the Iraqi army, don't fight us and we would treat you with dignity, on the most part, they didn't fight us. And then we dismissed them from their jobs and they were left unemployed, angry and humiliated. And after years of being under Saddam, there was, people taking revenge on the state. There was mass looting and not enough security forces to prevent that looting. The borders were open. So any foreign jihadi who opposed the US presence in Iraq could come through the borders. And so quickly there was a very chaotic environment, and Iraqis formed armed groups to protect themselves. You had insurgencies quickly starting up against the invaders and against the elites that the US put in power. And of course, Al-Qaeda came into Iraq. So all of this happened. But I think it's important also to understand who was advising the coalition. And the coalition had been advised by Iraqi exiles. And it was the Iraqi exiles who had this vision of Iraq as three distinct groups: Sunni, Shia, Kurd. And these parties were often Islamist. They had been living in exile for decades, many in Iran, others in Syria, some in the West. And they had a vision of Iraq which was, in a way, at odds with the population that had remained in Iraq all along. And it was on the advice of those exiles that the coalition disbanded the military, disbanded the Ba'ath Party, because these returning exiles wanted themselves and their militias to be the new elites, the new rulers of Iraq. And they have basically, came back with us and have basically been in power ever since in the country.
I'm getting all these memories of that period of time in my head right now. And I got to say, they're not good memories. Anyway, Emma, many countries, including those that supported the invasion, began to question the legitimacy of the war. Moreover, the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of US and coalition forces. Was the erosion of trust in US power general, or did it fall specifically at the feet of the Bush administration?
I think, if you look at the turn of the century, it really looked like the 21st century was going to be another American century. America was seen as having won the Cold War, and there was a general impression that it was liberal democracy from here on out. That was one path to modernity, and America was at the top, and all these other countries were seeking to get there. I think what the Iraq War did was really upturn that image, because you can look and think back now, like the hubris, the arrogance to think you can invade another country and put in a new government and democracy will flourish. And America threw everything at Iraq. It threw trillions. It's like $3 trillion was spent on Iraq, and turning this country into a democracy became this big project. That democracy was supposed to ring out across the world, that Iraq would set the example, and that didn't happen. So I think the failures of Iraq to become that type of liberal democracy that the Bush administration said was going to happen, coupled with how America violated the tenets of what you think a democracy is, with the human rights violations, with the torture, with the targeted killings and the collateral damage, mass incarcerations, holding people without any due process, kidnapping them in one place, taking them to another. All of this was seen as violations of everything that you think a democracy does. So I think it really tarnished the image of America as the standard bearer of democracy. And when you look at sort of democratic backsliding, it had been on the rise up until then. But Freedom House and others look at backsliding of democracy really beginning in 2006, and it's been backsliding ever since globally. And I don't think that's a coincidence that it just happened at the same time as America was engaged in Iraq and Iraq collapsed into civil war.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with lecturer at the Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs, Emma Skye. Emma, the human cost of the war can't be ignored. How did the war impact Iraq and its people? 20 years on, where is the Iraqi state? Is it stronger for having survived this war? Is it the plaything of Iran or the lackey of Western oil interests?
Iraqi people have suffered beyond measure. Whenever you speak to Iraqis, there's no Iraqi who has led a boring life. Every Iraqi has been impacted by war. But this, we tend to think of Iraq's history beginning 2003. It didn't begin then. Iraqis have been living through wars after wars, living through the dictatorship of Saddam, who mass murdered Iraqis, mass murdered them, and the mass graves that have been found have just been horrific. And they lived through years of sanctions. And when the 2003 war came, I think for most Iraqis, they were really hopeful that at last the horrors of the past would be behind them. And they thought, it's America, can put a man on the moon. They're going to turn their country into Dubai within 6 months. And that just didn't happen. So the state collapsed. All of these militias and armed groups and Al-Qaeda and then ISIS came in, and you had the regional powers also interfering. And Iraq has been through absolute hell. In recent years, there have been signs and hopes that the worst was behind Iraq. They came out of the civil war in 2007 with what we call the surge, or what Iraqis will call the awakening, that brought an end to Al-Qaeda. And there was hope that the country was then moving towards democracy. Unfortunately, in 2010, the guy who lost the election stayed in power and pursued very sectarian policies that created the space for ISIS to rise up. And then there was, again, another civil war. ISIS was finally defeated by about 2017. And Iraq became safer, but still the state was seen as not serving the needs of the people. In 2019, you had this very interesting phenomenon in Iraq, which was called Tashreen movement, where young Iraqis came out into the streets of Baghdad to protest that their government was kleptocratic. It was a government of thieves, that they were taking the wealth of the country and spending it on themselves, and that Iran was interfering everywhere. And they blamed the situation on the type of government that had been put in place by the coalition back in 2003 that kept this sectarian construct in power. And these young men and women were out day after day in the street, incredibly brave, as Iraqi security forces and militias fired at them. There were over 600 killed, bullets to the heart, gas canisters to the head. But they bravely proclaimed the sort of state that they want to live in. And I think it's those young people, that generation, who really don't remember life under Saddam. They have grown up. Iraq's a very young population. They have grown up in that post-war period. And they're not anti-Western. They're not lackeys of the West. They want their country. One of the slogans they kept saying was, "I want a homeland." And it's those young people that really give me hope for the future of Iraq.
Emma, has the US made any form of restitution for its part in the destruction of Iraq and the subsequent events of civil violence?
The US has spent $3 trillion on Iraq. It has invested heavily in building up the Iraqi security forces. It has a strategic framework agreement where it also helps develop the education sector, tech, private sector, all of these different things. So I'm not sure that you're going to get to a situation where the US accepts to pay restitution or compensation as such. I don't see that is likely to happen. But I think there are many voices that argue that the US should stay engaged in Iraq, in investing in the young generation and giving them opportunities to develop themselves to their full potential.
Looking back on the 20th anniversary, Emma, what lessons do you think we can learn from the Iraq War?
We say now, I can't imagine that we would ever do such an invasion again. It's really hard to see, but then memories are short. So I think, we all take away different lessons from the war, to have a strategy, to have a national strategy, to think about right from the beginning, how does this end? What is the outcome that you want? To have clear objectives, to have a political strategy and not just use the military, to understand that the local population has agency, that they have their dreams and their hopes, and they're not just there as an experiment for Western powers in democracy promotion. I think there's lots to be learned in terms of the limits of power, lots to be learned about humility.
Presently, Russia's special military operation against Ukraine, there's been a lot of people who have subscribed to whataboutism. For instance, Vladimir Putin was wrong in launching his invasion of Ukraine, but what about George W. Bush's war against Iraq? Are these two conflicts at all comparable?
I think many people, particularly in the global south, will say, yes, they are comparable. America would say they are not, because America never intended to colonize Iraq or stay in Iraq, where you can look what Putin is doing and say, look, he is trying to annex large swathes of Ukraine. But in terms of invading another country without a Security Council resolution, that is seen as comparable. And I think the fact that what happened in Iraq allows Putin to keep saying, look at Iraq, that in a way, Iraq did undermine America's self-image and its reputation globally.
Emma, the Iraq War seems to symbolize that democracies can be wrong-headed about waging wars as dictatorships. And when governments commit to war, not even mass public demonstrations against war can sway them. And in the lead up to and during the 2003 Iraq War, millions protested against this action, but to no avail. What does this say about government generally, that they all have autocratic impulses?
I think it says it's far easier for governments to pursue a foreign policy that they want without the same level of domestic scrutiny that domestic politics have. Really hard to get policies approved through parliaments that are domestic policies. But when it comes to foreign policy, it's far easier to launch initiatives and to do things in the name of national security that don't have the same checks and balances. What's interesting in the UK, I mean, in America, there wasn't such a large anti-war movement as there was in somewhere like the UK. And in the UK, Tony Blair really set out to win the argument for war. He wanted to convince the public of the necessity of going to war. And he used the media, he used Parliament, he kept trying to win that public debate. And in the UK, you had the majority of people who didn't go along with that, who didn't buy that argument. And I think it really led to a degradation in trust that people have in politicians, in the establishment, and it opened up space for populism. So it's had a huge impact on our domestic politics. I don't think you would have got to Brexit or to Trump without the Iraq War. I think you can draw lines from the Iraq War to both of those.
Wow, that's a big call, Emma. I mean, I'd actually agree with you on that one, but wow, that's the first time I've actually heard someone say that. So do you think for democracies, we have what would be loosely considered a national security trap, where politicians in the West may think that if things aren't going too well for them domestically, they can reach for the big national security stick for some form of ill-conceived low-hanging fruit where they can tap the nationalist impulse or nationalisms within the domestic community at a time of political crisis generally?
I think sometimes there is a risk of that, but you can look at how popular both Blair and Bush were at the time. They didn't need to do this war at all. I mean, Blair, when he was interviewed and people said, are you just going along with Bush? He said, no, I really believe in this.
Yeah.
You can look back and think of the speech that he gave in Chicago in 1999, I think it was, where he talks about the international community, that it is right for countries to intervene, not only in other countries, not only if there is a threat to them, but also if those countries are committing mass human rights abuses or there's a humanitarian crisis. So that was the spirit of that time of liberal internationalism, of this sense that we can make the world a better place by taking our responsibility further, not just to our own citizens, but to people overseas. So there was that strong humanitarian impulse that was there. And after 9/11, you had neoconservatives coming together with liberal internationalists to say, look, we can't afford to let such people, such dictators stay in power. They might have weapons of mass destruction. They might give those weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. There was this whole fear of loose nukes on the loose, and what might happen. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the leaders at that time. What was the spirit of the time and what was seen as the threat at the time? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And then people go down the holes of conspiracy theories.
All right, like very last question. Do you think history will repeat itself? I mean, we're currently looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. There are people who are busily speculating whether or not Russia will come out of it in one piece. You made mention of the fact that there was a concern about Iraqi loose nukes and weapons of mass destruction. Obviously, if the Russian Federation were to fall apart, that becomes a true reality of gargantuan proportions. Can you see that in the hypothetical situation of a Russia breaking apart, that we would have to have some form of internationally mandated Western military intervention to secure Russia's weapons of mass destruction?
I cannot see it going down that path because it's in no one's interest that that happens. It's in no one's interest at all that that happens. We are living in a different context. And I think what we are seeing is the end of America's unipolar moment. We don't know what is coming next. Will it be bipolar or will it be multipolar? So we're in this period, Gramsci referred to as like a time of monsters. Power is being contested, but neither America nor China nor Russians, whether it's Putin or those around him, will let the scenario that you have described actually happen. So I think we're into a different era. It's a very dangerous era because the boundaries, the rules, the new norms are all moving all the time. And with new technologies, with artificial intelligence, with all these unmanned weapon systems, we are moving into a really scary era that you can look back at the Cold War and you think, well, it never got hot because both sides had nuclear weapons and they knew that if they used them, it would be mutually assured destruction. Well, at the moment, we don't have that to create a check and a balance on what we do. So I don't see the future being similar to the past. I think we are going into unknown waters, which if we sort of formulate them in terms of great power competition, there's every risk that that could descend into great power conflict, when really we should all be coming together to look at how to deal with the environment, how to deal with pandemics, how to cooperate in order to save our planet and people.
Well, Emma, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks so much for sharing your insights on the 20th anniversary of the 2003 Iraq War.
Thank you, John.
Founding director of Yale's International Leadership Center and lecturer at the Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs, Emma Skye. Thanks for tuning in to the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. And please leave us your comments on inquiries@sageinternational.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe by hitting the like button and or leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to The Focus.